in June.
Yes.
But we hear the conservatives are considering like actually running somebody. I've actually not been sure to them. Like there's been a few things I don't like. I don't like.
I think that could be fine. I don't have a problem with them.
I don't like huge on finalists. I don't like huge on finalists.
Yeah.
Wanted to destroy it. But
I 100% we'll talk about it. Yeah, but
I like the I like the
we be on that.
I'm not sure if that's not making. Really like.
That guy down the yard, it's you.
Like what's something wrong with you? Like there's like something severely wrong with you. Like are you mentally okay?
No,
I like remember. Like I took me, I took me up. I think I used like what where you talk about him and all. I feel it. Which people should win it?
No,
For me it was. Oh, maybe it's command.
Are you doing the school discount?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. It's the
Yeah.
same. It's whatever it is a month, it's that equals what it is if you pay it home.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I still want to have to deal with that every month. Whatever.
Yeah. You have to pay for it, or do you?
I actually do pay for it. So like they offered me.
With
Like,
debit card? Money you just put on?
yeah. Well, I actually have a. Yeah, I have a picture. Yeah.
You're straight. Wait, are you a sophomore?
yeah, so I guess she's like.
Why would it matter? What?
Make my face from that.
You're the director.
Make my face from that. No, I could. I literally shave once a week.
Yeah, I just, yeah, I need to. I'm gonna do it before I go home. Are you gonna go for Thanksgiving?
Yeah, are you?
Yeah.
When you go home?
Monday, it's 25th.
I go home Saturday because I would go Friday, but I'm seeing the Wicked movie Friday and I'm not selling my ticket.
Yeah.
That's-
When I schedule my flight, when my grandma scheduled my flight, my 2 morning classes, well, they said they were gonna be in person. Since
They
we
moved
booked
them online.
They moved them online. I'm like, I could come on Saturday.
Yeah.
I could come on Saturday. Okay, this is me off, because now I have 2 extra days.
I agree.
And then I'm like, why'd you change? So I was like, I'm like, why'd you change? They're like, oh, like I was looking out Friday. Some months ago when I was dumb. Why can't like professors know when their class.
And my Monday night class, voting elections.
A little bit.
Not whatever the name of it, it's online.
The only class I thought was gonna have was like
Yeah.
my policy class. But they canceled their class. But I'm not gonna be able to. It's not gonna honestly.
But I wanted to.
I like to, yeah.
I didn't get these.
One day, I just-
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
I'm happy my class is meeting tomorrow. That's fine. Just makes me down.
Yeah.
He can reach it.
That's why I'm confused. I'm like, you should have done it.
Yeah.
And then like she sent the National Guard to the border one time. And then
Yeah.
like, why would it so like why would you put something like this already? Yeah, but they actually feel like it's just- it's
So strange happening.
like, this is hot coffee. I'm thinking like, what, it doesn't even much better.
It's so much. It's very harsh toast.
Yeah,
And I was like,
like, nothing.
I don't know. Yeah, I
But
What the, it's not watching for the environment.
like, he's, More,
The fact that he's from Long Island.
Yeah.
An environmentalist.
Well,
Not an
I do believe
environmentalist.
he does believe in climate change. He's not connected to the oil full lobby either.
Yeah.
That's the first Republicans.
So how do you change that?
And.
But the thing is. I don't think it's like foreign policy checks, these do a lot more,
Yeah.
We barely had any for only Marco and.
and, and,
Oh, I said-
and that's, and Mike Wallace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He officially made nominated Waltz today.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the review, because I'm a little worried that he's gonna backtrack on it.
But Gwinnell is saying.
Well, so is, RFK. He like, apparently not like publicly, but privately, he's like very angry.
RFK wants is equally species.
I don't think he'll get it.
I don't think.
I've also heard that,
Like, so you go up.
Mississippi Senator Ted Smith is gonna get, it could likely get,
I'm doing book speaking right now.
Oh, yeah, but he's a racist.
So I mean, I guess.
oh.
Joni Ernst wants to be defense secretary. I wouldn't be upset with that at all.
I think that
Except people.
She'd also be the
Senate?
first, she'd also be the first
And it was.
woman DOD to sign.
I find it funny that
That was
like,
like
like diverse, like, it's kind of like both like diverse, like cabinets and like all these first ones.
So I need
It's
some
funny.
things now.
Yeah, but it's not gonna be stabilizes life.
Oh, no, but I want to speak to much.
So there's like.
Oh, I think he'll bring back Ben Carson.
I know, I think he's gonna put Ben Carson in,
HSS.
yeah, that's what I'm hearing, that's what he wants.
That's what I've been.
I'm hearing he's gonna wanna put, Charles Webster or like in agriculture. Who's the guy that like ran like for the Browns?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's actually. There's like.
I love how he takes people in the house.
No, but he said, Mike Johnson said he's done.
Yeah, that's.
He took two.
We'll see.
We'll
We'll
see.
see.
I don't.
Yeah, put Trump in it.
Oh, the one you, no.
I'm going to challenge him.
We need that here. We need the infighting. I love it. Like, I love when they do. I really do. Because it makes our life easier. But, I also read that like, let's see, Cleese. He said,
They're also
Trump is,
making a very interesting change that.
what's the rule change?
If you run for a leadership position and you're already in a leadership position, you have to resign that. So if it's at least one speaker, it's to resign majority
I
leader.
think
And to
Jim
run
Jordan, Jim Jordan.
Jim Jordan would have to resign. Yep.
That's gonna stop a lot of challenges, I believe.
But like say she was in, she'd have to resign council chair. I think it's a beautiful.
I think it's actually,
Beautiful.
it actually shows that like, you don't just do things for like, spite, like you actually, you wanna win. Run, actually have a challenge, but you just wanna like make a point, you know.
I think it's beautiful.
But I do think that I'm apparently, he said, Trump said it's what, it's probably his limit. I'm like, it feels like a threat, but like, he said it's limit. Done. I get why he's annoyed. Like, you're rooting on majority. I don't feel a lot different than it is that. Wow. It looks like steel. Yeah, it looks like steel.
Question for you. Question. Name this band. This band.
Name the band.
What's the band name?
My friend said this. I love it. I love the new, I love our new, this new class is amazing. Like, I think I love all, they all are commercial, they're all normal. They're all common sense.
Hi, everybody. I just need a couple more minutes because we have one of our speakers who is on their way, that there seemed to be an accident on Mass Ave, but she's 2 minutes away, and then we're gonna get right started. Okay, and thank you all for coming today. We'll be with you in a minute.
She's still going to see the government.
We saw this this year, but she never.
That's why I don't stop trying. Her career was over when she stopped. She didn't see that.
Do you know that? Mrs. 305?
Yeah, I guess. Also, do you know who's really being considered? Oh, well, a lot of Trump's consideration. I was too long. He's not being
The deadline is only to, no, the deadline is only knows how to talk. Knows how to make it. Knows how to make something so smart, and that's what the Democrats need. I think you need to own Vivek, and I will die on that hill.
We need to run.
No, we need to own Vivek.
We need to run. I think it's really interesting. Like what people do, what is that? Like a chance to trade like that. Okay, we're running. It's actually, yeah.
Brown should run for governor.
You should run.
No, he should run for governor.
He's in the Senate. He wants to read the, yeah. He wants to read the Senate. No, yeah, this time, in all the, Democrats. I also don't think it's got land for
Oh, good stuff.
in some ways, yes.
I don't think Carolina was gonna be so close to that landslide. It's gonna land, did you go down?
But that's the thing, get demolished. Not bad. We want some going to that. That can speak for it. We expanded the Michigan part. There's some good things that happened. Yeah. I'm gonna enjoy more people probably. But I think that's just kind of what we. It was good, the Trump one complimented it all, you know, so like actually change our party. Rather than just like the electoral college. Yeah. Much bigger. But.
So you said you won't, stand with us or whatever it's called?
Sadly good. What?
I would add it on.
So happened. I used to like her. Do you know what not really liking her? Because I just don't. Like she was perfect because it was like so weird. It's like I was so because like kind of like a melodic, you know, like establishment, but like that they ruined it. Or they always did with all such go.
People are saying the New Jersey might become the next swing state.
If it does, it's good. I think it could be, but I think we can reverse the trends if we like actually change.
Look at how close Chicken got in 2021, and he's running again.
Okay, good point. But also like New Jersey is New Jersey. New Jersey, get rid of it. What do you think?
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for your patience. We're so glad that you're here today with us. First, I don't have my glasses with me, so we're gonna. Throw my head, yeah. How many days ago was there a national election? I ask you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This part I know. I'm Amy Dacey. I'm the Executive Director of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics here at American University. Welcome to the Sine Institute and AU Civic Life Series event. Tonight's topic is what just happened. Voting is over, and what did we learn from election 2024? I want to thank our incredible co-hosts, the School of Public Affairs and the Women in Politics Institute, who have been supporting this, and of course our AU Civic Life Initiative. Now I get the honor of welcoming our incredible all-female panel here today. Thank you very much. Our moderator is our very own Betsy Fisher-Martin. She is the executive director of the AU SPA Women and Politics Institute. She is also an Emmy-winning journalist and TV and news executive. We are so happy to have her here. Let's all welcome Betsy to. Yeah, brilliant panelists. We have Molly O'Rourke, who's executive in residence and director of the master's program in political communication at the School of Communications here at American University. And what I think is probably more important, Molly, she is the Sine Institute senior advisor here with us at the Institute, and she is the strategic mind behind our youth polling program. So let's all welcome Molly. Next, we have Kristen Soltis Anderson. She is the founding partner of Echelon Insights. She is a pollster, a speaker, a moderator, a commentator. She's also author of The Selfie Vote. So let's all welcome Kristen. Thank you. Cheyenne Daniels is a reporter, a race and politics reporter for The Hill, and she's joining us today as well. And excitingly, hello, Amanda. Hi, we also have somebody joining us remotely. I want you all to welcome Amanda Hunter, who's the former executive director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation. She's also a regular speaker at the We Lead program of Women in Politics here at American University. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Betsy.
Thank you, Amy. What a great introduction, and welcome everybody. I think we have all probably spent the last week thinking, like, what the heck just happened, right? And I don't think there's one answer. So we're going to get into the multiple answers of what happened, why, and as Amy alluded to, what can we take from it. So maybe I'll start with the pollsters first, because I know you all have probably examined every which way the exit polls, as well as the demographic information that we've gotten from the returns. And maybe, Kristen, I'll start with you. The Trump voters, do we know who they are? He made gains in, I think, every demographic, save for college-educated women, right? But who are the Trump voters, and how did they materialize and turn out in higher than I think anybody maybe really expected?
Well, Betsy, thank you so much for that question, and I'm thrilled that you're moderating this panel. Thank you to Amy for including me, and I'm really glad that you all have turned out for this. I know a week after the election, if you work in my field, you've gone over this constantly, and it's starting to feel like, okay, how long are we going to spend unpacking what happened in this election? The reality is a long time, because understanding what happened is going to be informative.
Sorry, ladies, I hate to interrupt, but could you just speak a little louder so everybody in the back's having a little problem?
Sure, you got it. So the question that was asked was, who is the Trump voter? And when you win a national election, and you do so by a point or two, as it looks like Donald Trump will do, and you improve among almost every demographic group, as you noted, it really isn't easy to just pigeonhole who the Trump voter is into any one group. This was not an election where we saw, for instance, the gender divide get wider, and we could say, well, Trump voters are all, guys. And you can't say, well, it's that Donald Trump ran up the numbers among white, non-college educated voters, which was kind of the narrative coming out of 2016, because his coalition was much broader than that this time around. His coalition saw the biggest growth in places that are quite diverse, particularly places where at least a quarter of the population is of Hispanic descent. He did best relative to the last election in places like urban cores and cities, which I think tells us something really interesting about what this election was about beyond just the economy, cost of living, anti-incumbency, which we can unpack a little bit more. But I do think it's notable and frankly probably healthy for this country that this was not an election where we saw one candidate running up the numbers in, say, rural areas or with white voters, while another candidate ran up the numbers with other voters. That because it was this not perfectly uniform, but closer to uniform shift, I think that in some ways, to the extent that this felt like an unbelievably divisive election, the result did not show most of our divides getting wider demographically.
Right. And what surprised you, Molly, about the results? Because I mean, you've been crunching the poll numbers in advance. What moved and what surprised you?
Well, I think what was not surprising throughout the public polling in the fall is how little the race moved overall. I mean, it was a very static race. It shifted, big shifts were 2 or 3 points in one direction or another. And so, really the stage was set very early, I think, for the structure of the race. What did surprise me is Trump's, as Kristen pointed out, Trump's growth across the board. Unlike 2016, where he seemed to make some sort of surgical gains with particular audiences, either demographic audiences or around specific issues, that wasn't the case this time. But he really did, Trump really did increase his support, though he's with Latino men and with men 18 to 29. And that kind of outsized growth in his support, I think that was very notable.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember election night watching the returns come in, and at one point, I think it was Steve Kornacki on MSNBC was dissecting the vote in New York City and talking about, Harris's underperformance in New York City, and it was like, okay, well, that's the kind of night it's going to be when he's doing well, in urban areas.
Yeah, I mean, as Kristen said, that sort of across the board
Exactly.
Growth, and probably all of you have spent a lot of time watching cable news over the last week. Have seen that map,
exactly.
That sort of shows the red spread across the country, unlike in 2016, where it was, in pretty targeted areas.
Yeah. Cheyenne, let me bring you in this, because not only did he sweep, every battleground state that we had been looking at, right, but also won the popular vote. Did you think that the race shifted in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, or was this kind of always going to be his to win?
I have to be a little bit honest, and as close as this election was, I don't think I was surprised to see Trump win, for numerous reasons, right? I mean, you can talk to any Democratic strategist and they'll be like, well, she only had 100 and some days, and she already was coming in the underdog, being a woman, being Black, coming in with the Biden legacy sort of on her back, and people being upset with the Biden administration, sort of all of those things. But I think, when we think about how divisive the election was when it was between Trump and Biden, and then you add in then again those sort of overlaying identities that Kamala Harris had now as the candidate, I wasn't exactly surprised to see that Trump came out the victor. But what I will say is surprising is a little bit of the demographic shift that we saw him improve so much, particularly with Latino men. And I think that was something I was not expecting. I maybe was expecting a little bit of a stalemate, frankly, between Trump and Harris when it came to that demographic. What I thought was very interesting was there had been so much conversation around Black men and whether or not they were going to show up at all, let alone for Harris. And they proved the media wrong on that, where not only did they show up, but they did show up for Harris. I think polling was showing she lost by only 1% from what Biden won in 2020. And so there were little elements that were surprising to me, but the outcome I don't think was all that surprising to me.
Yeah, Amanda, let me bring you in because you and I have spent a lot of time thinking about the gender gap in our work on women in politics. And as Cheyenne was mentioning, it didn't pan the way that I think a lot of people thought we were going to have this huge gender gap going on, right? And a lot of that had to do with young people and young men in particular. So what surprised you about that? And how do you think that kind of the Harris campaign sort of maybe building up their vote with women neglected in fact to appeal to a lot of men that Trump seemed to appeal to. Plus, Trump obviously peeled off a fair amount of women voters as well.
Well, thank you, Betsy. And I think it was October, we had released a gender on the ballot poll that showed a big gender gap when we looked at women voters. So I was really surprised that that did not pan out. But in hindsight, it does sort of make sense in that we've seen in our Barbara Lee Family Foundation research that even though we saw women interviewed saying, I don't like Trump, I don't like his personality, I think he's rude, I think he's gross, voters don't need to like a man to vote for him. And also Trump is authentic. Even though he might be offensive, he's still authentic to who he is. And we heard that a lot after the election and exit polls just on TV with people saying that's why they voted for him. And we've seen in our work that authenticity is really important too for voters. So I think that makes sense. But I was really surprised. I had thought that abortion was going to be a much bigger driver, just given the data that we had through gender on the ballot.
Yeah, Molly, let me bring you into on that abortion question, because I know you spent a lot of time thinking about that as well. It didn't play as big of a role. In fact, I think in the exit polls, 60% of voters said that they supported legal abortion, yet 30% of those actually voted for Trump. And was it because Trump kind of waffled all over the place on the issue and it just didn't resonate as a top threat to people?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that was one of the disappointing dynamics for the Harris campaign and for Democrats overall. I think it is important to point out, though, that in several states that went for Trump, there were successful ballot initiatives. And so I think the result is a lot more nuanced than people are making it out to be.
Was there maybe a permission structure of like voting for the initiative, but then?
I also think that, Trump was deceitful, but masterful in early October, sort of, muddying the waters to say he would veto a national abortion ban. The public polling in September had showed, what was coming to be a very historic gender gap. And I think the Trump campaign probably read that and knew that they had to do something to, start to shrink that gap. And they did pretty successfully by, sort of being on both sides of the issue after, bragging about being the person responsible for Dobbs and for overturning Roe, and then kind of giving very mixed signals where I also think it was very hard for Kamala Harris, who's very outspoken about her position on women's reproductive health and very comfortable talking about it in a way that Joe Biden wasn't.
Right.
It still was hard for her to leverage that to her advantage because it's clear now with the Supreme Court to voters that having a pro-choice president does not mean that Roe is going to get reinstated if we reelect Kamala Harris. It's a long and complicated road, as voters have seen over the last year. And so I think it really just took some of the momentum out of that issue. But I think it's not the right reading to say, oh, it didn't matter. I think it does matter. I just think it's much more nuanced and complicated than the polling looked in early September, where there were a lot more clear dynamics.
And what do you think, Kristen, just the issue of economy just outweighed that issue of abortion at the end of the day?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you looked, for instance, at the exit polls in a state like Pennsylvania, you asked people, what was your top issue? Abortion and the economy were both somewhat similar in terms of, you had about 30% saying it was their top issue. But I think for this election, you've got to take even one step back further from just the issues themselves or when we say, what's your top issue? We give people a list of 6 things. When we say, pick from this list. I got asked a question by Amy Walter, who from the Cook Political Report. She sent me a note a couple of weeks ago. She said, Kristen, what do you think voters think this election is about? I don't know. Let me ask them. So I did a focus group of voters for the New York Times. It was Michigan voters. And before we kicked off the conversation about issues specifically, I just asked that question. I said, what is this election about to you? And no one said the word economy. They all were talking about things like, I just feel like this country is off track. I just feel like we've got to get back to the values that we used to hold. It was a little bit more 35,000 foot level. And that's not to say people weren't then subsequently in the group alarmed about the economy, concerned about the border, worried that there might be an abortion ban, all of those things. But it was this broader sense of dysfunction. It just feels like nothing's working anymore. And if you're a Harris voter, you think Trump is the reason everything feels broken. And if you're a Trump voter, you think only Trump can fix everything that's broken. But it was still that overarching sense of everything feels broken and a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to get back to functional again. And I think in an election where incumbent parties around advanced democracies around the world are all being taken down regardless of ideology, Democrats are held responsible for the feeling of dysfunction that people had. Being the challenger at the end, if you looked at the exit polls, the voters who broke in the final week or two, they tended to break for Trump. And I think it was just that ultimate calculation of things feel like they're on the wrong track. I think that putting Trump back in charge might undo some of the things I haven't liked over the 4 years. And that buyer's remorse, I think, was about more than just the economy.
Yeah. And Cheyenne, this notion of a change election, how much of a penalty do you think Kamala Harris and her campaign paid for not differentiating themselves enough from the Biden administration?
Yeah, she tried a little bit. I don't think
Here
she
and
tried,
there. Yeah.
right? And it's very hard. We heard her even in her speech announcing her campaign back in July. I mean, she thanked Biden, she heaped praises on him, and it wasn't until I would really say the last couple of weeks of the election that she came out and said, my administration is not going to be another Biden administration. But she needed to start off right from the get-go saying how she was going to be different from Joe Biden and not necessarily sitting there saying, I'm proud of the work that we have done in the Biden-Harris administration. That's nice. You should probably feel proud about that if you're the vice president. But sort of sticking with that for so long and coming to Joe Biden's defense several occasions and sort of sticking by him, she really needed to come out sooner and sort of say, this is what a Harris administration would look like. Here's what I'm going to do differently. The concerns that you have around policies maybe that I was in charge of, whether that was borders are or anything like that, here's how I'm going to be different in 2025 through 2028. And she just didn't do that fast enough.
Yeah, I mean, there were plenty of opportunities, I think, in various interviews for her to say what she did different, and she just kind of backed away from that. I mean, on one hand, right, she's the vice president, she has some ownership of the administration.
She's not going to come out and be like, oh, I'm not happy with what Joe did.
He's the one that picked her and the one that supported her, and so it was kind of a very difficult spot. For sure. Amanda, let me ask you back on the topic of gender, because, and you mentioned our poll earlier, one of the things to me that was the most surprising in that poll of women voters that we did was 4 in 10 women, when asked the question, did they know somebody personally who would not vote for a female for president, said yes. That was striking to me. To what extent do you think, now Kamala Harris didn't really do a lot of, gender identity, discussions during the campaign. It certainly was very, very different than we saw of Hillary Clinton in 2016. But to what extent does that role of gender, did that make an impact in this election, do you think?
It's interesting because I don't think, coming from an organization that studies women in executive office, that her gender played that big of a role in the conversation in the way that Hillary Clinton's election did. There was no fight song. There wasn't any Katy Perry until the end. But I do think that a lot of the criticism that we saw of the vice president was affected by her gender. Even the very tricky dance of what can she say to criticize Joe Biden as a woman and as his vice president. I think that people may have seized on her if she seemed ungrateful or she seemed too critical because he did pick her. And I don't think a man would have that same concern about criticizing their running mate. I know that people said Al Gore distanced himself too much from Bill Clinton when he ran. So I think that that's one thing. And she really had to credential herself because people needed more evidence. They needed to know what she did as vice president, even though people may not have had those concerns about a previous man who served as VP. And I think the other interesting dynamic in the way that she got to the top of the ticket is because she was not in a primary and kind of stepped up out of a sense of duty. She didn't face the straightforward ambition backlash that we've seen a lot towards other women seeking high office. So I think there are subtle ways that gender definitely influenced the way that either she had to position herself or she was critiqued. But I don't think that it was front and center where people were thinking, I can't wait to elect a woman as their top issue, but would also be curious to see what the pollsters think of that too.
A good cue up for you guys. Yeah, I mean, I think when you would bring up the question of Harris's gender, you know, nobody wants to say, I'm not gonna vote for. And so I'm glad you asked it in that way. Yeah, we know somebody.
It's a tricky pollster phrase, right? If you know
One
someone.
thing that I did see, so we asked an open-ended question about why are people voting the way that they are? And it was a very, very, very small number of responses who mentioned this. But a few did sort of latch onto this strength versus weakness dynamic that I think was really important in this election. That I think Donald Trump in past elections had run as, I am the chaos candidate, I am going to be your wrecking ball. And this time around, he actually tonally shifted a little. I mean, even though in his rallies, he definitely still had that wrecking ball thing going on, I think in his ads, it was much more about strength versus weakness. And I think that does put a female candidate in a tougher spot because she didn't want to lean into her gender. And we would see in the open-ended responses, again, of 1,000 people we surveyed, this was like 3 or 4, but said, I'm worried other countries won't respect us as much. And this was also wrapped up in things like they felt like she was perhaps too flippant about issues, or she didn't seem to take things seriously enough. And so you can read into that if you want, that that's a gendered criticism, but
Yeah.
So I didn't see people saying outright, I don't want a woman as president, but you would see these hints of, I just think Donald Trump is stronger.
So
And
it
there's a
can
way to view
materialize
that
in a lot of
through-
different elements. Do you agree with that, Molly?
I do, and I also think, you know, her rollout, which was very successful, was somewhat constrained by gender too, in that she came out sort of with joy. I mean, that was like the theme of week 1, 2, 3, and being a happy warrior. And I think if that was what the country was craving at the time, but I think if we all know that being an angry woman coming out fighting with language that is acceptable and okay for Trump to use would not have worn well for her to be
Yeah.
making her introduction.
Well, but that seemed to be her close in many respects, was, you know, attacking Trump, he's a fascist, everything else, right? It seemed to turn her tone and her argument at the closing was, to me, very, very different than beginning.
Yeah, I think she did, you know, I think given the compressed timeline that she had to introduce herself, it had to sort of, you know, be sequenced.
Right.
That she was introducing herself in a way that was appealing and talking about her vision and who she was and who she was going to fight for and what she stood for. But the idea, you know, that any scenario in which she was going to be successful was going to require her to keep Trump at the low end of his, you know, he has kind of a tight band, right? In that he's got a high floor and a low ceiling. And for her to be successful, she was going to have to keep him at that high floor. And that was going to involve making the case against him and reminding voters of their very real doubts and concerns about him. You know, everyone's got their very confident kind of narrative about what happened, But, you know, the idea that, well, she should have been more positive or she should have been more negative earlier, I think it was, for her, it was always going to have to be a comparative race where she had to start off positive in introducing herself and obviously close by including the case against Trump as her closing message.
Shai, let me ask you while we're piling on the Harris campaign here. You did a piece yesterday quoting James Carville, who a Democratic strategist, of course, that I'm sure everybody is well acquainted with in here, who basically put the blame and said, you know, defund the police is the stupidest 3 words in the English language, and really putting the blame, so to speak, on the kind of issues of wokeness that were hurt the Democrats maybe in a lot of ways. What is your impression of that? And even though the campaign didn't campaign on that really at all, it was certainly capitalized on by the Trump campaign.
Yeah, so I think I would never go in a debate up against Mr. James Carville. Just putting that out there. But I do think it is a little bit of a harsh criticism considering that she kind of did the exact opposite. I mean, she spoke so heavily of being a prosecutor to the point where Black Americans were like, we don't want another cop, right? Like that was a huge thing for a really long time for many Black advocates. And so I think it was a little bit of a harsh sort of analysis. But what I do think it sort of indicated is that she could not separate her race no matter what she did in this campaign. The fact that she was Black, the fact that she came out in 2020 and said that she would be interested in finding ways to redirect funding from police departments to other resources in communities stuck with her, going even back as far as her time in the Senate when she talked about wanting to do a case study on reparations, something she spoke little of during her campaign. And I think, you know, no matter what she did, right, there's no way in America to say, you know, this is a Black person running. And I think, you know, even if we think about if it had been Obama, right, and he were running, you know, let's say he didn't run in 2008 or 2012, but if he were up there, there'd be no way to separate his race and the previous comments on racial justice and racial equity. So I think, again, it was a little bit of a harsh criticism, but just showed how much race played into this, whether she leaned into it or not.
Yeah. Did you want to weigh in on that, Kristen? Oh, okay. Well, let me ask you, because this is a question that I keep hearing from people, including just walking into here today. I was hearing this conversation in the hallway regarding the Latino vote. And the fact that the question basically is, if you're a Hispanic, how could you vote for somebody who is basically for mass deportations of immigrants from this country? And so how do you square that circle when you think about the Hispanic vote supporting Trump?
Sure. So I think the statement you just made was missing an important word. You said deport immigrants.
And legal immigrants.
Right.
Yes.
And I think that is an important distinction.
Yes.
I think that is part of why you see Donald Trump able to improve his numbers among Latino voters, even while embracing the sorts of policies that the Republican autopsy document after Mitt Romney lost in 2012 specifically said, don't do this. I mean, when Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012, he suggested that it would be smart if you encouraged folks who had come here unauthorized to self-deport. And that was considered an extreme view. And now you have like signs that say mass deportation now.
I don't think that autopsy report went anywhere.
Donald Trump did the opposite of it in many ways, and he didn't read it. Became president.
Yeah.
And so I think there was just a big misreading by Democrats of what the actual politics of issues like immigration, the interests of working class voters and what they want. I mean, I think about a place like Osceola County, Florida. So I'm from South Orlando. Osceola County is a county with a very large Puerto Rican population. One of the fastest growing places in the country. Lots of folks came there after Hurricane Maria. And it's the sort of place that used to be somewhat light blue, I'll call it. Voted for Joe Biden by, I believe, a 14-point margin. But I noticed in the 2022 midterms that even as the red wave kind of failed to materialize other places, in Florida it still had. And it was in places like Osceola County where it had, where Ron DeSantis like overperformed there, really did well. And on election night, I thought, you know, if these comments from the Madison Square Garden rally, where you had this insulting comic get up and he made comments about Puerto Rico, that if you're going to see that have an effect, you'll see it in Osceola County. And sure enough, I log in Florida, which is very efficient at counting votes. had it at like 60 or 70% reporting, and it showed Trump was only losing Osceola County by 1. Oh, he lost it by 14 last time around. And then you refresh again, and 80% are counted, and he's up by 1. You refresh again. I mean, Donald Trump wound up winning Osceola County, which is not something a Republican has done in quite some time. And so I think it was just a misreading that for your median Latino voter, opposition to illegal immigration was in any way going to be disqualifying. I just think the politics of that issue are much more complicated and different than I think people inside the bubble allowed for. Interesting.
I think that's work that Democrats clearly have to do going
Well,
forward. And that's
yeah.
probably, number 1, 2, and 3 on the agenda is to leave behind kind of a simplified vision of what the Latino vote means.
Right.
And also other kind of euphemisms of voters of color and these are different audiences, and we can't make those generalizations that if we're just on the right side of immigration, then that should take care of the Latino vote. I mean, Latino men are different than women, for example, and what Kristen said about sort of misreading the issue agenda, Donald Trump does, and the campaign said, clearly offensive things about immigrants and about Hispanics, but he stands for a American dream that and a prosperity in a lot of voters' minds that there's an appeal there and there's an attraction, and I think Democrats need to be able to do more to make those connections and to stand for that same kind of opportunity agenda that right now they're just not seeing.
Yeah, what else is in that Democratic autopsy report that probably is getting written right now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, it'll be interesting
Yeah.
to see. I think it's only a week and everybody's already written their version of it.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be better to wait for the facts to come in and for things to settle down a little bit. I think what we pointed out earlier, Trump's gains with younger men, I'm not sure if that's really about younger men or if it's really about media channels, which has a much more kind of like significant campaign strategy effect of where are people getting their news and are we communicating in a way that makes it relevant and fits into their lives. So I think the focus on like the kind of loss of younger men is going to be larger than just kind of their demographic group, but also about the media channels that we use. I think that the kind of connection to an economic agenda of opportunity and working class voters is going to be first and foremost.
I mean, because just thinking of the party 20 years ago, completely different.
Yeah, and I think Democrats, part of the shock is sort of how did we get to this? How did we get to this place? We are the party of the working class. What do you mean?
Yeah.
And clearly there's a disconnect between how, what Democrats, what we think we're communicating and what voters are really hearing.
We're gonna take your questions in just a few minutes, but Amanda, let me also bring you in on, while we don't have the first female president, this election was notable in several cases for women in politics. Can you give us a little bit of a download of the new women that are coming into Congress and the fact that we have some state legislatures now having sort of parity and representation?
Absolutely, yeah. There were several milestones for women in politics down ballot this election, including, like you said, I believe there are 3 state legislatures now that are 50-50, which is pretty amazing. It looks like obviously they're still going through some of the tabulation for House races, but it looks like we're not going to break any records in terms of House and Senate representation for women, but we will have one more woman governor. So we will have a record 13 women governors. And then fun fact, in January for 2 weeks, we'll have 14 when the Lieutenant Governor Bethany Hall Long becomes governor for 2 weeks when the governor becomes mayor. So that will be our high watermark. I think also 2 really notable things that people will study for years to come are Nikki Haley's debate performances and the vice president's debate performance, because we've seen in our work for years that women are punished for going negative, and women have to be very careful when contrasting with opponents. And I think both candidates were a masterclass in moderating their facial expressions, moderating their tone of voice, looking impeccable, all of the incredibly high and unfair standards that people have towards women, they exceeded. And I think the confidence that the vice president exuded during her debate without ever rolling her eyes or looking angry or anything is something that women will study before their own political debates for years to come.
And we have 2 Black women now in the US Senate as well.
Yeah, and that is also a record, and also doubles the record for Black women in the Senate, since we have only ever had 3 before, right? 2 elected.
And I would add too, I think the other thing, in addition to Angela also Brooks and Lisa Blunt Rochester, who both made history from their own states just by being elected, in addition to now 2 sitting Black female senators, I think we also see our first openly gay Latina House member, as well as the first openly transgender female who was elected as well. And so,
And AU alum.
yes, absolutely.
Right.
And so I think, there was a lot of focus, and, when I was at Howard University, on election night and the following day for Harris's concession speech, it was actually shocking how many of the students gathered on that campus, of course, in HBCU, were so heavily invested in also Brooks and Blunt Rochester's races, and were so aware of the history that was made, despite the fact that Kamala Harris lost. And I think sort of shines a light still on where we're seeing voters. In an election year, we always say, a lot of these other races get overshadowed by the presidential election. And I think this year we didn't see that as much, actually.
Well, and also, this is another good point too, is that even in those battleground states, we saw, even though Trump won those battleground states, in all of them except for Pennsylvania, we saw Democratic Senate candidates winning. How do you guys explain that ticket splitting that obviously went on there?
Well, I think it's complicated. In some ways, there's some generalizations. In some ways, it's kind of race by race. But, those Democratic incumbent Senate candidates in the summer thought they were going to be running with Biden at the top of the ticket. And they knew they were going to have to outperform Biden by several points in order to be successful. So I think they were preparing their own race and not to, protecting themselves against being nationalized from an early point. I think, like, for example, in Michigan, Elise Slotkin, where EVs were, very much a part of the conversation and being used to kind of attack Democrats, both her and Harris, she cut her own very clear ad about, I don't support EV mandates. And so she did a lot to consciously and proactively separate herself. In Wisconsin, Trump won by less than 1, and I think Tammy Baldwin won by less than 1. So to her and her campaign's credit, she did what she needed to do, but it wasn't like it was, a really significant difference. I do think that in the kind of the commonality between those Senate races is that those Democratic candidates did run ahead of the top of the ticket with non-college educated voters, which, it is pretty critical. Arizona, I'd have to go back and look again. You had a kind of unique situation there with Carrie Lake on, and so that was a little bit of a different dynamic. But I think that was key to those Democrats being successful, is to run much more competitively with non-college voters.
That makes sense.
The only other thing I'll add, and this is going to be Republicans' challenge. Your Republicans are feeling great right now, on top of the world, about to control all the branches of government, but this all comes up to the voters every 2 years. And Donald Trump is very good at turning out Donald Trump's coalition. But I still think there's some open questions how transferable that is to others in the Republican Party. And so that is why what's fascinating to me is I would get asked all the time, well, gosh, if Republicans were running a Nikki Haley or a quote unquote normal Republican, wouldn't they be running, 5-10 points ahead? And I said, I don't know. In a lot of these Senate races, you do have a quote unquote normal Republican running, and Donald Trump is going to do 2 or 3 points better than that candidate. And so in midterms, especially, we have seen Democrats overperform expectations Because when you have an unlikely voter coalition, which is what Donald Trump has,
Right.
they're harder to turn out. And so I would
Okay.
say, if you are a Republican, don't pretend like you've got this locked up for 4 years, because you've got, a year and a half at most before everybody disappears to go run for reelection. And if you're Democrats, don't despair too much, because these midterms are gonna come up and they're gonna come up fast. And
We're gonna
Democrats
have
are
a slew of special elections now too.
Right. And that's right. And so these things are always, they're always in flux, and Republicans have got to figure out, Donald Trump is able to turn out a coalition. How do we transfer or transport that coalition to the rest of the party?
Makes sense. All right, let's do some questions.
Hi, my name is Kendra Dooley. I'm an SBA student here at American University, and I wanted you guys to kind of explain a bit looking at the numbers. So in 2024, Kamala Harris got 71.9 million votes, and Trump got 75.1. And then in 2020, Biden got 81.2 million votes, and then Trump got 74.2. So as you can see, that clear difference. Trump had a million more votes than last year, and then Harris had lost at least around 9 million votes. So what was the reasons for that? Like, how could you explain those moderates deciding to not vote or to vote for Trump?
So I think there's going to be a lot of analysis on that. And the truth is we're coming off of a real high water mark in terms of turnout in 2016 and 2020. And so, part of I've followed this debate over the last week, like what happened to those voters? Why did they opt for the couch instead of for Harris or coming out for Democrats? And I think there's a lot of work to understand why that is. Some of the argument is like they're reverting to form, right? That because turnout was so high, those voters were so animated in 2020 and 2016, you kind of can't keep that level of engagement and sustain it for 3 election cycles, that it was just naturally going to drop off. I'm not saying I'm necessarily a subscriber of that theory, that's one of the theories. I mean, there's also kind of the idea, and this really has to be kind of empirically studied and not just thrown out as a truth, that the traditional ground game that Democrats use isn't as effective or successful as what Republicans have put into place. When I started to mention kind of where people are getting their news and media circles, and much more on social media and targeted podcasts and very different media channels. So I don't think that there's not an easy, obvious answer a week out. It's a very important question to study. And I think there's some good theories out there, but that work still has to be done.
Hi, my name's Eli. So obviously Republicans are taking this trifecta and the margins and even when the popular vote as a mandate. I've heard multiple people, even Republican strategists, saying like, be careful not to overread what this election said. As you said, like a lot of Democrats won in states that Trump won by some points. I think Arizona went to Trump by 5, and Gallego won it by like a couple thousand votes. It was close, but he still won it. How do Republicans avoid like not, especially usually Trump is very like overzealous about like what he wants to do and tries to do a lot more than necessarily is doable, and obviously Republicans want to do a lot more. So I guess my question is, how do they avoid like overreading into this election?
So Donald Trump and the Republicans have a big challenge in my view, and they've had, the expectations are fairly high to the extent that they won a lot of voters who felt buyer's remorse, that they had voted for Joe Biden because they wanted some kind of normalcy. I want the adults back in charge. I want to break from the chaotic Trump years, and then felt that they didn't get that. When those voters shifted back to Trump, if I asked voters at the end of the Trump presidency, did you approve or disapprove of the job Trump did as president? His numbers were a lot lower in January of 2021 than they were in October of 2024. The people's memory of his presidency was, actually, I remember it being pretty good. So the expectations are going to be very high that he's going to deliver peace and prosperity. And if he doesn't, voters will hold him to account for that. Because there are some voters that are in his coalition for ideological reasons. They want to see him put points on the board for, dismantling the bureaucracy and all those sorts of things. But there are a lot of voters that don't care about dismantling the bureaucracy. They just want groceries to be cheaper and they don't want to be worried about foreign conflicts. And so that's the tough balance they're going to have to strike. There's a robust history in American politics of people getting elected, assuming they have a mandate, putting forward some kind of bold something or other that voters then go, oh, that's not actually what I wanted. You had George W. Bush and his reelection do that with Social Security reform. And then you had Obama with the Affordable Care Act. That was something he felt very strongly he had a mandate to do. I think now in hindsight, I don't think Democrats would say, oh, it was bad of us to do the Affordable Care Act, but they paid a political price for it in a very big way in that 2010 midterm. And so there is a pretty strong historical pattern of presidents coming into office saying, America loves me, I'm going to do big, bold things. And then America going, well, wait a minute, hang on. It's your political science professors would call it thermostatic public opinion. America works like a thermostat. Everybody says, oh, it's too cold in here. Let's vote for hot. And then all of a sudden hot comes into office and they're like, too hot, too hot. I'd like it to get cold again. And so the public works like a thermostat. I firmly expect to see that show up in polls about a year or two from now.
And that's why the midterms are usually tough for the first term administration, right? Okay, let's see who else has questions.
So oftentimes Pennsylvania is called the bellwether for the rest of the country. And I think, again, we expected that with what the media was saying. Do you think that that's still true today, that, that Pennsylvania is the bellwether of the country? And should we keep expecting that when we saw a blue wave just in the midterms?
I don't got a great answer. I mean, Pennsylvania was always going to be critical to Harris's, path to victory, given that she lost all of the battleground states. It's hard to say that Pennsylvania was the linchpin. I think, how Democrats felt on election night is that when they saw that Pennsylvania wasn't coming in, because it came in a little earlier, or at least partials did a little earlier, there was, a feeling of real despair that this wasn't going to go well. But because of the number of electoral votes, and it's going to continue to be, I think, a bellwether. But I think that the other, those other states are going to be incredibly competitive too, and they have different demographic compositions. And so there's going to be a lot of recalibrating of strategy around
I
that.
feel like this has always been flux too. I mean, as a born and bred Florida woman, as a swing state,
Right.
not when Florida was voting like to the right of Texas or, I mean, these things are always in flux. The other thing to remember about Pennsylvania is I think we're actually not going to be paying that much attention to Pennsylvania in the midterms because you won't have a Senate race. Josh Shapiro is pretty popular as governor. The Republicans will mount a challenge, but whether that will be one of the hot races remains to be seen. And then the 2028 question depends on who's on the ticket.
Hi, I'm George. I'm a SPA student here. So there's sort of a reductive question out there of like, should Kamala have done Rogan? But I'm wondering more as like a general strategy going forward. Do you think that Democrats should sort of insert themselves into apolitical but sort of center-right podcast spaces, or should they try to create their own version to be more successful electorally?
Diane, you are meeting here. You want to take that?
Sure. So here's the thing. Trump definitely did the podcast field before Harris did, and that worked very well for him. I don't think we can discredit all of the work that Kamala Harris did on, let's say, the Call Her Daddy podcast, right? Her message particularly was to women. I mean, think about the majority of her around reproductive freedom. Then you look at, she went on Charlamagne the God's show, The Breakfast Club, twice in 2 weeks. A town hall specifically designed for Black voters. So Harris's goal in going on these specific podcasts, these specific shows, even Howard Stern. I mean, she was trying to speak to her base, but also the base that she needed to get that coalition, right? So going on the Breakfast Club is speaking to Black voters, but specifically Black men who she needed. You look at the Call Her Daddy podcast, it's speaking to women and telling those women, you need to come out and turn out the men in your life too to vote for me. So, the question of does she need to go or do Democrats need to go to the more moderate, maybe apolitical side, I think runs the risk of, are you even speaking to anybody who would want to vote for you anyway? Or are you wasting your time? Or is this going to be one of those things where it's like, why aren't you coming and talking more to Black voters or to Latino voters who feel that you don't show up until you want something from them 2 weeks before an election? And so I think she might receive a lot of criticism for the media that she did go on, but don't forget, she also did sit down and do her 60 Minutes interview. She did the traditional things that I think can't be ignored. And then she said, who are those that I need this coalition to get me elected to? And that is who she tried to speak to.
She did Fox News too.
And she did do Fox News, which I think.
But no, she didn't get much of a word in, but she did it.
I think that surprised many of us to
Yeah.
hear that she was going to give that a chance.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, this will be our last question. Hi, my name is Ella. I'm a student here at AU. So, really, Harris and her campaign sort of de-emphasized the role of her race and gender, but you have alluded quite a bit of like how those two factors did play a role. But would be interesting to hear more about sort of how their intersection played a role in how this election turned out, and any thoughts on how this might have repercussions on future possibilities of electing a woman, or especially a woman of color. Thank you so much.
Amanda, you want to hit that?
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you. I think that there was a lot of pressure on Vice President Harris to address her identity in total. And it was a double-edged sword in some ways as well, leaning into gender. I think that she was, in talking about her background and introducing herself in her videos during the DNC, she talked about her mother being an immigrant. She talked about her father being from Jamaica. She was clear about her background, but it wasn't something that she leaned into as a theme or as a leading theme on the campaign trail. But I think that it was also important that when Trump said horrible racist things about her and about others, and a lot of the, even just the general critiques that he threw out were very veiled and full of dog whistles at times. And that was a really low point of the campaign. But I think that the vice president really succeeded in showing strength and warmth, which we know that voters need to see from women when they seek executive office. And I would hope that this would not negate the ability to run another woman in the future, especially as we were just pointing out all of the women who did break barriers down ballot, including 2 Black women elected to the Senate. And we always point out when the foundation was up and running that men lose elections all the time, and no one says that we shouldn't run men for president anymore. So I think that that's a slippery slope if that's the takeaway of this election.
Diane, you cover these issues.
If I could add quickly on the aspect of her race, I think she had a very fine line to walk here, right? If you remember in 2008, 2012, Obama didn't talk much about his race. I mean, there were moments, if you even read his autobiography, and talking about grandmas and aunties coming up to him and saying, you're putting your family at risk. And as a woman of color, Harris, probably felt that even more so. And in many of the women that I spoke to, from Black Pack with Adrienne Shropshire to Gabrielle Wyatt with the Highland Project, there was a very real fear from Black women about what Harris was about to undergo by taking on the mantle of becoming the Democratic nominee. And it was very interesting when I interviewed Clyburn for the Switch Up podcast, and the comments that Trump made questioning whether or not she was Black came up. And he mentioned, there's a certain element that Black folks learn about, which is you don't give time to the racism, right? You can't buy into it. And so she had to be able to walk this line where she could say, I'm a woman of color, I'm a proud Black woman. And she did that by talking about being an HBCU graduate, by talking about being an AKA, by holding her election night and then concession speech at Howard University. All of those things, were that subtle way of her really showing off her identity as a woman of color. But I will add to this, Black women knew what was coming, specifically what she was going to deal with, the rhetoric she was going to face. And there are some out there, and I actually reported on this a little bit, who said that until we have a white female president, we will not have a Black female president, that Black women cannot achieve something before white women do. And so I think the issue of does race transcend gender did come up a little bit in this year's election.
Well, there are a lot of people who also think that maybe the first woman president would have to be a Republican. Yeah, too. Yeah. I mean, there's that school of thought as well. So anyway, as Molly mentioned, this is a discussion that is going to continue on for months and months, years and years. But we are grateful that you all spent this afternoon with us. And Amy, do you want to have some?
Yeah, we'll just
comments?
finish out. Can we thank Betsy and Molly and Kristen and Jenny? We're absolutely honored to have you here and spend some time, and Amanda too, virtually. I know it's not always easy. You did an amazing job, being with us. This is a part of the Civic Life initiative that we're doing, here on campus. We have the chairman of the steering committee, Professor Tom Merrill, here, and wants to encourage you to go to the website. There's a lot of events coming up. We have an event next week. It's a virtual event next Tuesday at 1 that's going to talk about presidential transitions. These are all things that about the process and understanding. The other thing that we always say at the Sign Institute, it's even more important, the fact that you took the time today to come and to learn about what was happening speaks volumes. But what we do when we leave this room matters even more. So continue to have conversations about, this election and about what's happening. And, there's a lot of resources on campus too. I know we've got a week of kindness as well. And our professors are going to be talking about, there's going to be a lot more programming on this. I also really want to encourage you to find, we have this incredible panel that speaks on these issues all the time. So go to the Hill, reach out, follow Cheyenne. She does incredible work. Kristen, you're always on TV and looking sharp, and Molly, you're on there too. So literally look to see what they're saying. And of course, Betsy is commentating a lot, and Amanda will be looking out for, all the work you're doing, and excited to have you be involved again in the Women in Politics program. Again, thank you for all you did to take time to do this. Keep the conversation going. And one more round of applause for the